Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and a privilege to be having this discussion with Ridham and Rajiv. So, we are looking at India in the next 25 years. India has the vision of becoming a developed economy in the next 25 years. There are various projections talking about India's GDP growth rising to 25 to 30 trillion by 2047. Some even talking about 40 trillion. There are various opportunities in this path, and one big opportunity I would say is our size. We are already the 5th largest economy, and we are also the most populous nation. We have already beat China to that. And the added advantage is that we have a large working age population, which is definitely an edge at a time when most major economies are seeing aging happening. Talking about opportunities, there are various opportunities. We have a strong service sector, digital boom that we have seen in the last few years, and many more. So I will go with my first question to Ridham. Ridham, my first question is that India has an edge when it comes to offshoring in services sector. But we cannot remain complacent. There is already a lot of competition from various quarters. So what do you think we need to do to further strengthen our leadership in this segment and make further inroads into this segment?
Yeah, thank you, Rajani, and it's a pleasure to be here. So I think in services, I think we got a silver lining during COVID. However unfortunate COVID was. The fact is that during that period, the typical CEO of multinational companies learned that it's okay to work from home. And if you're working from home, it's a whole lot cheaper to be in Mumbai than Florida. And so during this 2-year COVID period, almost 1 million jobs got shipped to India for offshoring work. And today we have over 5 million people, and we think that that number will only grow in the times to come because India is offering a unique advantage that is in the setting of a world that is facing a major demographic challenge. So I think when Elon Musk says that population is a bigger crisis than climate change, I think I empathize with that view, and we heard it from the previous speakers at the end, that given the global demographic problem and the pace at which the world is aging, it's unlikely that people are going to be available to do the work that is required to keep global growth going. In fact, as you noted, China's population will decline this year. And if you look at each of the next 10 years, labor is going to be a negative contributor to Chinese GDP. So India is a standout. It has scale, unlike, say, Africa, which is also young. It has English-speaking skills, and I think it is tech-savvy. So I feel that the challenges for services are actually not as intense. I think we have arrived on the scene and probably will surprise on the upside.
So that brings me to the next question. Services sector, definitely we have an edge. But Ridham, how can we emulate that success in the manufacturing sector? That is where we have been struggling.
Yeah, we have actually, and the irony is that in 91-92, when India launched reforms, they were largely targeted at the industrial sector. And in this 30-year intervening period, the share of industry in GDP at various points in time actually declined and is largely flat. So we have not succeeded in growing industry. And in fact, we are one of the unique cases in global history, global economic history, that jumps straight from agriculture to services without getting industrialized. So if you go back to, say, 1950, at that time, 2/3 of India was agriculture, about 15% was services, and 20% was industry. And big picture, that's today services and agriculture have swapped places. So services is 2/3 of our economy. Agriculture is 15%, and industry remains largely at 20%. So it's very unique in world history. No other country has gone through such transition. I think it is to do with the way business is conducted on the ground, it is very difficult. And that, I think, has changed at the margin. So three things go in favor of a manufacturing boom, as I would call it, and that's what our opinion is for the next 10 years. The first is geopolitics, China plus one. There's an urgent requirement for multinational companies to ship their production at the margin away from China to other countries. The US may actually legislate this year which will ban US companies from putting incremental manufacturing or FDI into China. India is a very attractive destination. It has scale. A lot of people say Vietnam is going to compete with us, but Vietnam is a $300 billion economy, which is not going to be capable of absorbing $500 billion of FDI. If you have to put $500 billion to work, there is only one country on the planet that can take it, and that's India. So I think India offers that position to a lot of multinational companies who are looking to diversify supply chains. The second thing that has arrived for India is policy change. So for the first time in India's history, the government is using taxpayers' money to incentivize corporate investments. So in 2019, just before COVID, we cut corporate tax rates. Today, a corporation in India pays lesser tax rates than the CEO who runs that company, which has not been the case in the past. And during COVID, we launched various production-linked incentives targeted at sectors where we want investments. The idea behind PLIs was that there was a certain cost of doing business, cost in many forms, cost of infrastructure, cost of dealing with bureaucrats, cost of dealing with the system. And the government's own estimate was that number was a 5% disadvantage for India versus other countries. So let's put that as an incentive on revenues to overcome that cost difference. So we have got policies now in place to incentivize investing. The third and most crucial factor which favors manufacturing is India is probably going to be the consumer market that multinational companies want to access. So think about India's income pyramid. It sits like this. We have a bottom layer of very poor people. We have a top layer of very few rich people. And then we have a middle class which is about 60 million in size. At the top of the pyramid, we have about 5 million people who are earning $35,000, 5 million households, sorry, I should say, who are earning in excess of $35,000, which would get classified as rich. And then we have tons of poor people. A lot of them do not even get a second meal during the day. So it's an income pyramid which has not been attractive so far. However, our per capita income has crossed the $2,000 mark, and history tells that it usually proves to be an inflection point, and from there you get a big surge. China went from $2,000 to $5,000 in 5 years, from 2007 to 2012. We think India will probably take 10 years. But what happens then is that the income pyramid becomes something like this. The top end, which is 5 million, becomes 25 million, which means in the next 10 years, India will throw 20 million new households who will be capable of buying stuff that rich people in other parts of the world buy. That type of growth in typical consumption is not available anywhere else on the planet. And to access that growth, it becomes crucial to have on-the-ground presence. So no surprise, a lot of companies are looking to set up manufacturing because they want that consumer. I actually keep telling my analysts abroad that they will all need to have a line item on India because India will decide whether their company misses or beats earnings in the next 5-10 years. That hasn't been the case before. So I think there's a very strong case for manufacturing. We still need to make things easier on the ground. I think states need to cooperate and make conditions easier for companies to invest. And I think the biggest risk is skills. And I think a lot of multinational companies have encountered that problem. There will be gaps in skills. There will be periods when our wage costs rise a lot more because the market does not respond. And then the market will respond. But that skills gap is still a risk factor.
So absolutely, scale is an advantage which will help us in manufacturing sector also. Talking about another big opportunity is the digital transformation that we've been seeing in India for the last few years. Rajiv, my next question is to you. So, in fact, the ECO survey had highlighted that the development that has happened in public digital infrastructure in the last 5-6 years would add around 30 to 50 basis point to India's potential GDP growth. So, how can we ensure that this digital technology helps not just in rapid growth, but inclusive growth, inclusive and sustainable growth? Because that's going to be very important going forward as to what kind of quality of growth do we see.
Yeah. So, thanks a lot, and it's great to be here. If I, we talked about some numbers. We did a report, what India would be at 2047, and our view was probably $26 trillion. But the more important thing is that per capita income would be growing from $2,500 to $15,000. So 6 times growth in per capita income in 25 years' time. And that's the opportunity I think Ridham was talking about in terms of consumption and everything. One of the force multipliers for that is what India is doing in digitization. So my view is just the opposite. My view is that digitization or the public goods is forcing inclusion in a phenomenal way in India. I think that's what is really impacting in a very positive way. And if you step back, I think the entire digitization journey started with the private sector, which was earlier with the telecom sector. And today, we know the numbers, number of subscribers, 1.3 billion, and number of people on the broadband is almost 800 million, largest consumption of data usage on an average per capita consumption. So if you look at that, and then we saw Aadhaar, then we saw Jan Dhan, which was really a lot of people opening bank accounts, and then we saw UPI, which really saw the birth of the India stack, which was really open stack, open source APIs where companies could come in, plug in, build their own softwares, and what it provided was, which was very different from what we saw in the rest of the world. It was low cost. You could scale at a rapid pace, you could deal with massive population, and it was owned by the government. So it was not like a walled garden. It was open for everyone and I think that's been one of the most successful experiments and is giving tremendous competitive advantage to India as compared to other geographies, especially in other emerging markets. And the reason I say that is, just look at direct benefit transfer, almost $300 billion of money getting transferred into bank accounts, which was going through multiple channels, and we all know about the leakages there. The second is, 60% of India still lives in rural India. And, they didn't have access, the same access as people at urban India had, whether it's in terms of education, whether it's in terms of knowledge, information, finance. So what this has provided, it has provided that kind of access to them. And that's what is creating this massive growth. So if you just look at, and financial services probably is one of the biggest examples of that. So Indian SME market is already $350 billion short in terms of credit. And the reason is because we don't have enough backup. Now with UPI coming, almost 260 million people on UPI, 40%, 50% of the real-time transactions that happen, payments that happen globally are happening in India. The kind of credit backup that is available now, credit being available to individuals who were earlier not bankable, credit being available to SMEs, MSMEs, the pace at which all these things are happening is just creating, India's private credit to GDP ratio is 55%, which is amongst the lowest in the world. And the more we accelerate that, the more it accelerates consumption. So, and this is a big enabler for that availability of credit. The cost of doing business, so if you look at the logistics side that's coming up, the cost of doing business is coming down in a very significant way, leveraging some of this stuff. The information available on credit, it was announced in the budget, the agricultural stack that's happening. So the availability of information to farmers, to traders and everything else, I think that's another thing that's enabling in a big way. ONDC will bring in millions of MSMEs and SMEs into the digital marketplace, which was earlier not available. OCEN, which is the credit enablement network, will again provide the credit and everything else. So I think credit availment, information knowledge on agriculture, the health stack that's coming up, Ayushman, availability of all your health records at one place so that you can go to various public sector institutions, eventually enabling much lower cost insurance. So everything that's happening right now, I think the thing that it's doing is it's providing access. It was providing availability, which was not earlier available. The ease of doing business is much better. The cost of doing business is much lower. The formalization of economy, which leads to better tax growth, which leads to better government providing information, more money to investments, more money on subsidies to support. So I think my personal view is that this is one of the biggest enablers of inclusion in India. You can argue whether what AI will do to all this, and I think that's a separate question altogether. But I would say definitely what has happened in the digital public goods space will be emulated, is being emulated by around the world, and will really force not only growth, but inclusion in a very, very big way.
So completely agree with you on that, Rajiv. This whole digital transformation that we are going through will in fact lead to more inclusive growth. But in fact, I'll come to the other point that you mentioned about AI. Do you feel that this advancement of AI could result in, is there a risk of income inequality in India increasing because of something like that?
No, I don't see a risk of income inequality happening. Definitely there'll be a shift. I mean, earlier the jobs which were there, they will shift as has happened when you have massive technology change. But the value addition that will be available because of the availability of AI, and again the cost that the improvement that it can do to healthcare, the more efficient infrastructure that can be built, how it can enable education in a big way. I think all those are big positives. But yes, for sure, there are some jobs which are being done today will probably go away. And given the Indian demographic situation, I think we have to be very aware to see how does India play the AI game, not only in India, but globally from a skilling standpoint, building assets, positioning ourselves well, so that it can be another multiplier opportunity, which it can be. But I think we have to be very proactive in that. AI is going to be probably the most defining change from a technology standpoint in the next 2 to 3 years.
So yeah, definitely AI could lead to some job losses, but at the same time, we have to look at the positive side of it. It would lead to productivity increase, and that would be a big enabler. We have spoken about the opportunities for India, but it's also important to understand what are the challenges we foresee for the next decade or two. And while the opportunity is the big size that we have, that is also a big challenge. So we are talking about having a large working age population, but the challenge here will be we able to generate enough jobs for this working age population to be employed productively? Are we investing enough in human capital to increase the productivity of this working age population? And there are many more challenges in the sense that even the physical infrastructure in India, while there's a lot happening on that front, but there also we are still lagging. So talking about challenges, Ridham, what would you say are the big challenges that we should look at on a priority basis?
I think the biggest, Rajani, the challenge that we face is the structure of our workforce. Half of it is employed in farms, and it produces 15% of total output. The remaining half does 85%. So the farm labor in this country is very unproductive. So I think it's very crucial that we are able to revolutionize the farm sector. And to that extent, it's rather unfortunate that the farm laws have been set aside, because I did think that they held promise in revolutionizing the farm sector. So, just to share some statistics here, India has about 350 million acres of farmland. That's largely unchanged in the last 75 years. It's gone up a few million or gone down a few million, but it's largely unchanged. And about 137 million farmers own that. So it's just 2.5 acres of land per farmer on average. And in fact, I think almost half of these farmers actually own probably just an acre or less. And it's on such small plots of land, you cannot really apply scientific techniques, you cannot use tractors, you cannot bring irrigation water, it's just not commercial. And therefore the vagaries of rainfall, the vagaries of weather, tend to affect the sector and therefore have consequences on the level of poverty. So either we take a large number of these people out of the farm sector and employ them somewhere else, or we do something to consolidate the farmland. But I think that's going to be our biggest challenge for the next 10 years. The second one, which you rightly pointed out, is about the skilling. Now, I do think that skilling will be addressed by market forces. I don't really think the government needs to do much there. The market will respond, but there may be gaps, as I alluded to earlier on, between the requirement of the market and what supply we get, and that may lead to volatility in wages. But I think we need to keep an eye on that. Also, the point that Rajiv made about artificial intelligence, about technology. So some of the skills that we are currently handing out to our younger generation may not be useful in 10 years from now. So there will be some reskilling risk as well. The third is, I think, energy. Now, very clearly, if you look at what we are targeting on renewable energy and the commitment that we have made, will mean that our entire energy complex will have undergone dramatic change in 10 years. However, we still have to deliver that 500 gigs of renewable energy. And the chances are that we may not get there. And in the meanwhile, we'll still be subject to volatility of global energy prices. And the context here is that there are very few countries in the world that will actually experience a rise in per capita energy consumption. Today, the average Indian consumes about 800 watts of energy per day, ex-food. Which compares with 9,000 watts in the Western Hemisphere. And 800 will go up quite dramatically in the next 10 years because access to energy has improved considerably over the past few years. So we think 800 goes to 1,300. It's still a far cry from 9,000. But in most parts of the world, 9,000 is not changing, whereas our per capita energy consumption is going to grow. So we will still be, I think, subject to some risk from volatility in energy prices. We have overcome some of it because we are now reducing our fossil fuel intensity, but we need to continue to strive at that. So, I've pointed out three factors. There are lots of things. We are a democracy. Every 5 years there'll be an election. There's no guarantee that when 1 billion eligible voters come to the polling booths, 700 million show up approximately, that they will put a majority government every time. We have enough history. Actually, in my whole professional lifetime, I never saw a majority government until 2014. So, that will have its own consequences. We have geopolitics, I don't think, but I think that's a question that Rajiv will probably address in greater detail. Maybe he should actually, because I think he understands that better. But there are, other risk factors as well, but I chose these three.
So, Rajiv, before we talk about geopolitics, would you like to highlight any more challenges apart from what Ridham spoke about?
No, I think he's covered. I think he's covered all of them. I think the way, if I have to highlight, the last point around just, sort of political stability, especially where you have high levels of income inequality. I think to maintain that and sustain that over a period of time, I would say that probably in my view, would be the biggest thing. And then how India deals with energy and artificial intelligence, the entire energy transition. We still depend on, 50% of our primary energy sources are still, we import them. And every time there is a geopolitical issue that happens around the world, I think we suffer because of the consequences of that. And you import inflation into the country, which is always damaging. So I think how we deal with that, how can we proactively deal with that, I think that's something that's going to be very critical. And I certainly feel that AI can be a tremendous opportunity, but I think we just have to be looking at that in a very conscious way. And I think because it's being handled by private sector and, if we can provide the necessary impetus, I think it could be another great opportunity, but it could, create some short-term disturbances as well.
So, obviously, there are many challenges on our path to becoming a developed economy. But if we step back and if we look at the big picture, globally in the last few years, a lot of developments have happened in terms of all of us went through this pandemic, we are going through this war, Russia-Ukraine war, we have seen trade war happening on and off. So a lot of political, economic, trade relationships have changed over the last few years. So, Rajiv, how do you think India, what should be India's strategy? How should we position ourselves in the global arena?
Yeah. No, I think that's a really, it's becoming a more and more important question. I think the gradual belief now is that globalization is slowing down. The world benefited a lot, and maybe some parts of the world benefited a lot with globalization. That's changing. The narrative of nationalism is much higher. And if you look at the data, global trade data versus GDP, I think some of that will be borne out. But I would say that apart from globalization, it will pick up. I think it goes through its cycles. It will pick up. I think it's being a big. All of us know we have benefited as a country. We have benefited enormously from globalization. But what's very important is what is now in vogue is this entire concept of friendshoring. So, you have to be, globalization will happen, it will not be across the world, but people would want to partner with countries who they trust, who are credible, who they believe are their friends. And I think for India, I'll just step back a bit. For India, globalization is very, very important. I think we have a demographic dividend or the issue, and unless we are able to deal with, if you look at the cycles of globally countries that have had explosive growth. So in 1910, 20, 30, you had US, then you had Germany, you had Japan, you had South Korea, you had China. So in the last 100 years, 150 years, if you have to look at countries that had explosive growth, a lot of that was on the back of exports. Yeah, US had a very large domestic economy, massive rollout of railroad infrastructure and other infrastructure, and that definitely enabled. But the other four rode a lot on exports. So for India, if we have to be successful in achieving our aspirations and raising the income levels, then I would say the most important thing is how do we raise, get more into exports, and for that, how we deal with the geopolitical situation. Secondly, you need a lot of investments. You'll need $4 to $5 trillion of investments to support the infrastructure growth that India needs. India doesn't have that kind of savings. Our savings have been stagnant, and a lot of that goes to funding the government deficit. So I would say that is also important. And thirdly, for energy, if we talked about risk of energy transition and how India is engaging both for investments and energy with the pockets like Middle East are very, very interesting, and how the energy, India wants to be an exporter of hydrogen. I think that's so how we build that entire ecosystem of energy transition in a global arena, and how do we deal with law, regulation and policy, I think that'll be very critical. How India does that, I think they're doing a great job, honestly, from a foreign policy standpoint. But I would say, being part of global supply chain, leveraging on this China +1 or Europe +1 or whatever +1, and actually ensuring that it doesn't become India +1. I think it's very critical that we maintain that stance. FTAs, we entered into some FTAs which led to more challenges for us, and how India enters into some of these FTAs, some of them like with the UAE, Australia, there are conversations with some of the Western European countries, and eventually at some stage, some kind of things with the US and others will be very critical. The third, I would say how we use the Indian diaspora. I think it's a great way. It's becoming more and more relevant. It's becoming more and more significant. And I think the current government doing a great job of engaging with the Indian diaspora. And I think that's also very important, because when you have a large political base in those countries of people who have a connection with India, I think it's something that we should do more to leverage. And I think the current government is doing a great job of leveraging that. And the fourth, I would say, is creating these win-win moments. India orders, Tata's order a massive contract. The largest airline contract is there. You have, leaders, prime ministers of France, US, India on a platform, talking about it, giving it visibility, so that it's seen that India is not just, importing, from those countries, or, taking jobs away or anything else, but it's also being part of the the entire value chain and helping those countries also to meet and achieve their economic objectives. Because at the end of the day, for globalization to succeed, I think we have to address the political agendas and the economic agendas of each of those geographies. It cannot be a one-way traffic. And sometimes in democracies, that's a challenge. And therefore, seizing these win-win moments and creating noise and communicating around that is a great step forward. So I would say, you know, India has to be a very active player. Globalization is critical for India. India has to protect its interests. Data privacy is something that will come into play. But at the end of the day, for India to achieve its economical dream and economic vision, I think it's very important that we are a very integral part of the global economic supply chain.
So absolutely, embracing globalization to our benefit would be the key enabler here.
Yeah.
So I think with that, I'll end our conversation. I think the key here is that if we look at the opportunities and challenges for both the aspects, the important thing is scale, which is a big opportunity for us and also a challenge. So the beauty would be as to how we convert this challenge into an opportunity so that India can move towards its vision of becoming a developed economy in the next 25 years. So thank you very much. Thank you, Ridham. Thank you, Rajiv, for sharing your
Thanks, Rajani. Thank you.
And thank you for a patient.
For more interesting content, like, comment and subscribe to our NASSCOM YouTube channel.